I am Maya Rodriguez, 28 years old, and 3 days after Hurricane Isabella devastated our Texas coast, I stood in a Red Cross relief center covered in mud and salt water, holding a crumpled piece of paper that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The Red Cross volunteer looked at me with confusion and said the words that still echo in my mind. "Ma'am, we've been trying to reach you for 72 hours. Your sister Sofia registered your address as evacuated with family, but you're clearly not with family." What she didn't know was that my own sister had left me to face a Category 4 hurricane alone, despite promising our dying father she would take care of me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the Rodriguez household meant understanding that family came first, no matter what. Our parents, Carmen and Miguel, had immigrated from El Salvador in the 1980s, building a life from nothing on the hurricane-prone coast of Galveston, Texas. They instilled in us the values of loyalty, sacrifice, and unwavering support for one another. Our small two-story house on Seawall Boulevard wasn't much to look at, but it represented everything our parents had worked for, and they taught us that family bonds were stronger than any storm that nature could throw at us. Sofia and I couldn't have been more different, despite sharing the same bloodline and upbringing. She was 4 years older, naturally charismatic, and possessed an innate ability to charm her way out of any difficult situation. From childhood, Sofia had been the golden child who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. She excelled in school, dated the right boys, and seemed to glide through life with an ease that I could never quite master. Her successes came effortlessly, from being homecoming queen to landing a prestigious marketing job straight out of college. I, on the other hand, was the steady one, the reliable daughter who stayed close to home and took care of the day-to-day responsibilities that Sofia always seemed too busy to handle. While she built her career in Houston and married David Chen, a successful software engineer, I remained in Galveston, working as a social worker for the county and living in a modest ground-floor apartment just 6 blocks from our childhood home. Our parents never said it outright, but the expectation was clear. Maya would be the one to stay close, to be available when needed, to sacrifice her own dreams for the sake of family stability. The dynamic became even more pronounced after Dad's diagnosis. 3 years ago, Miguel Rodriguez was told he had stage 3 lung cancer, a consequence of decades working in shipyard construction without proper protective equipment. The doctors gave him 2 to 5 years, and suddenly our family's priorities shifted dramatically. Sofia would visit from Houston on weekends, bringing expensive gifts and making grand gestures that our parents cherished. She would take them out to fancy restaurants, arrange for private doctor consultations, and shower them with the kind of attention that money could buy. Meanwhile, I handled the unglamorous realities of Dad's illness. I drove him to chemotherapy appointments every Tuesday and Thursday for 18 months. I researched treatment options, organized his medications, and held his hand during the nights when the pain was too intense for sleep. I rearranged my work schedule countless times to accommodate medical emergencies, and I watched my own savings account dwindle as I helped cover expenses that insurance wouldn't touch. But somehow, in our family's narrative, Sofia remained the devoted daughter while I was simply doing what was expected of me. The hurricane season of that year had been particularly active, with meteorologists warning that the Gulf Coast was overdue for a major strike. Living in Galveston meant hurricane preparedness was a way of life, but this season felt different. Dad's health had deteriorated significantly over the summer, and the stress of evacuation planning weighed heavily on our entire family. Mom struggled with the idea of leaving their home, the physical representation of everything they had built together, while Dad's weakened condition made any evacuation complicated and potentially dangerous. Sofia and David had purchased a beautiful home in the Woodlands, a master-planned community about 45 minutes northwest of Houston, specifically chosen for its distance from flood zones and hurricane impact areas. Their house was spacious, comfortable, and perfectly equipped to accommodate extended family during emergencies. They had guest bedrooms, a generator, and enough supplies to weather any storm comfortably. It was the obvious choice for our family's hurricane evacuation plan, and Sofia had repeatedly assured our parents that their home would always be available as a safe haven. During Dad's good days, we would sit on the back porch of our childhood home, watching the Gulf waters that could be both beautiful and threatening. He would tell me stories about the hurricanes he had experienced as a young man, how communities came together during disasters, how family bonds grew stronger when tested by adversity. Mija, he would say, using the term of endearment that made me feel like his little girl again. Promise me that you and Sofia will always take care of each other. When your mother and I are gone, you only have each other. I would nod and promise, never imagining that I would one day question whether Sofia would honor that same commitment. The summer before Hurricane Isabella, Dad's condition began declining rapidly. The cancer had spread to his liver, and his oncologist gently suggested that we might want to consider hospice care. The conversation was devastating for our entire family, but it also brought us closer together in some ways. Sofia began visiting more frequently, sometimes staying for entire weekends, and for a brief period it felt like we were functioning as the unified family unit our parents had always envisioned. During one of these visits, Dad called Sofia and me into his bedroom for what he said was an important conversation. He looked frailer than ever, his once strong frame reduced to skin and bones, but his eyes still held the intensity that had defined him throughout his life. I need to know that you two will take care of each other, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya, you've been carrying too much of this burden alone. Sofia, you need to be more present, more involved in the day-to-day care. He made us promise, right there in that room, that we would support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. Sofia cried and promised that she would do better, that she understood the sacrifices I had been making, and that she was committed to being a more involved sister and daughter. She talked about how guilty she felt for building her life in Houston while I handled the difficult realities of Dad's illness. She promised that when the next emergency arose, whether medical or weather-related, she would be there without question. I believed her completely because I needed to believe her, and because the alternative was too painful to consider. As hurricane season approached, our family developed what we thought was a comprehensive emergency plan. Sofia and David's house in the Woodlands would serve as our evacuation destination. Sofia would drive down to Galveston with David's SUV, which had plenty of space for medical equipment and supplies. She would help load our parents and their essential belongings, then drive them safely inland, while I followed in my own car with additional supplies and our family's important documents. The plan seemed foolproof, practical, and it gave our parents peace of mind knowing they would be in a safe location with both of their daughters nearby. We practiced the evacuation plan twice during false alarms earlier in the season. Sofia drove down from Houston as promised. We loaded the cars efficiently, and
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
made the journey to their house without incident. Everything went smoothly, and our parents commented on how reassuring it was to know they could count on both of their daughters during an emergency. Dad especially seemed relieved that Sofia was taking such an active role in emergency preparedness, and I felt grateful that the burden of care was finally being shared more equally between us. The first warnings about Hurricane Isabella came on a Tuesday morning in late September. The storm had formed rapidly in the warm waters of the Gulf, intensifying from a tropical depression to a Category 2 hurricane in less than 24 hours. Weather forecasters were calling it an extremely dangerous system, with the potential for catastrophic damage along the Texas coast. Galveston County officials immediately began urging residents in flood-prone and beachfront areas to prepare for possible evacuation orders. I called Sofia as soon as I heard the first weather reports. She was in a client meeting but called me back within an hour, her voice filled with the same concern I was feeling. We discussed the timeline, reviewed our evacuation plan, and agreed that she would drive down Wednesday morning if the storm continued on its projected path toward our area. "Don't worry, Maya," she assured me over the phone. "I'll be there tomorrow morning, and we'll get everyone to safety just like we practiced. Dad's going to be fine, and we'll ride this one out together as a family." Wednesday morning brought more alarming news. Hurricane Isabella had strengthened overnight to a Category 4 storm, with sustained winds of 140 miles per hour. The National Hurricane Center issued a hurricane warning for the entire Galveston County area, and local officials ordered mandatory evacuation for all residents in coastal areas. Our neighborhood was specifically mentioned in the evacuation order, which meant we needed to leave within the next 12 hours to avoid being trapped by the storm surge and wind conditions. I called Sofia at 7 in the morning, expecting her to already be on the road. Instead, she sounded frantic and overwhelmed. David had been called in for an emergency at his company, some kind of server crisis that required his immediate attention. Sofia herself had a major client presentation that afternoon, one that could determine whether her marketing firm landed a $1 million contract. She explained that they were both trying to rearrange their schedules, but it was proving more complicated than anticipated. "Can you handle getting Mom and Dad loaded up?" she asked. "I'm trying to get away, but it might be this afternoon before I can leave Houston. Maybe we can meet halfway, or you could bring them here directly." The suggestion caught me completely off guard. My small sedan wasn't equipped to handle Dad's medical equipment, wheelchair, and oxygen concentrator. More importantly, Dad's condition had deteriorated to the point where the stress of a longer car ride without proper support could be dangerous for his health. I explained these concerns to Sofia, reminding her that our plan specifically relied on David's larger vehicle and her assistance with Dad's care during the evacuation. She listened but seemed distracted, and I could hear voices in the background suggesting she was already at her office preparing for the client presentation. "Look, Maya, I'm doing everything I can to get away. Just start getting them ready, and I'll be there as soon as possible. We have until tonight before the storm hits, so there's still time." By noon, the situation had become more urgent. Hurricane Isabella was tracking directly toward Galveston as a powerful Category 4 storm, with landfall expected around midnight. Emergency officials were warning that anyone who remained in the evacuation zone after 6 p.m. would be on their own, as first responders would no longer be able to reach them safely. I called Sofia again, this time with genuine desperation in my voice. "Sofia, where are you? The evacuation order is mandatory now, and they're saying we need to be gone by 6 o'clock. Mom and Dad are getting scared, and I can't handle this evacuation alone." There was a long pause before Sofia responded, and when she did, her voice carried a tone I had never heard from her before, a mixture of frustration and what sounded almost like annoyance. "Maya, I'm in the biggest meeting of my career right now. This contract could set us up financially for years. David's situation is even more critical than mine, some kind of security breach that could cost his company millions if he leaves now. We're both trying to wrap things up, but we might not be able to get away until later tonight." The words hit me like a physical blow. She was prioritizing work obligations over our family's safety during a life-threatening emergency. "But Sofia," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "Dad can't wait until tonight. The roads will be jammed, the storm will be too close, and his health can't handle the stress of a last-minute evacuation. You promised him, you promised all of us, that you would be here for the next emergency." Another pause, longer this time, and when Sofia spoke again, her tone had shifted to something that sounded almost defensive. "Look, you've been handling his care for 3 years. You know his needs better than anyone. You're perfectly capable of getting them to safety. Take them to the emergency shelter at Memorial High School. It's only 15 minutes away, and they'll have medical support available. I'll come get them as soon as the storm passes and bring them to our house for recovery." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was suggesting that I take our dying father to a crowded emergency shelter instead of the comfortable, safe evacuation plan we had carefully developed. "Sofia, the shelter is for people who have nowhere else to go. Dad needs quiet, comfort, and access to his medical equipment. Your house is exactly what he needs right now. That's why we made this plan in the first place." I was pleading now, hoping she would recognize the gravity of the situation and remember her promises to our father. "Maya, you're being dramatic. The shelter will be fine for one night, and emergency shelters have medical staff available. Dad will be safer there than trying to make a long drive in dangerous conditions. I promise I'll come get everyone as soon as it's safe to travel again. This is just a temporary change of plans, not an abandonment." But it felt like abandonment. After years of watching me carry the burden of Dad's illness, after promising to be more involved, after assuring our parents that her home would always be available as a safe haven, Sofia was choosing her career over our family's immediate safety. The conversation ended with her promising to check on us after the storm, and me realizing that I was entirely on my own to protect our parents during the most dangerous natural disaster our area had experienced in decades. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity and growing despair. I helped our parents gather essential medications, important documents, and a few personal items. Dad was confused about why Sofia wasn't there, and I found myself making excuses for her absence, telling him she was caught in traffic when I knew she was probably still in her office building in Houston. Mom sensed that something was wrong but didn't press for details, focusing instead on making sure Dad had everything he needed for what we all hoped would be a short stay at the emergency shelter. Loading Dad into my car was heartbreaking. He was so weak that even the short walk from the house to the vehicle exhausted him, and I could see the fear in his eyes, as he realized that this evacuation was nothing like the smooth, comfortable process we had practiced earlier in the season. Mom held his hand in the back seat, while I drove through increasingly heavy rain toward Memorial High School, where hundreds of other evacuees were seeking shelter from Hurricane Isabella. The shelter was crowded, chaotic and completely inappropriate for someone in Dad's condition. Families with young children occupied most of the available space, and the noise level was overwhelming. The medical staff consisted of a single nurse and a volunteer EMT, neither of whom had experience with cancer patients requiring specialized care. I managed to secure a small area in a corner of the gymnasium where Dad could rest on a cot, but the concrete floor, harsh fluorescent lighting, and constant noise created exactly the kind of stressful environment his doctor had warned us to avoid. As Hurricane Isabella approached the coast that evening, I sat beside Dad's cot, holding his hand while he struggled to breathe in the humid, crowded shelter. Mom tried to remain optimistic, but I could see the worry in her eyes, as she watched her husband of 35 years suffering in conditions that were far from the comfortable, safe evacuation we had planned. Every few hours I would step outside to call Sofia, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Her absence felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical pain the hurricane could inflict. The storm made landfall just after midnight, bringing with it winds that shook the school building and rain that pounded against the windows with frightening intensity. Dad's breathing became more labored throughout the night, and by morning it was clear that the stress of the evacuation and shelter conditions had significantly worsened his condition. The volunteer medical staff did their best, but they lacked the equipment and expertise needed to properly support a terminally ill patient during a medical crisis. By the second day after the hurricane, with roads still blocked by debris and emergency services overwhelmed, Dad's condition had deteriorated to the point where the shelter's medical volunteers recommended immediate hospital transport. The ambulance ride through storm-damaged streets was terrifying, and I found myself wondering how different things might have been if Sofia had honored her commitment, and we had evacuated to the safety and comfort of her home in the woodlands. It was on the third day, while Dad was stable but still hospitalized, that I went to the Red Cross Relief Center to register our family's status and request assistance with temporary housing. I approached the volunteer desk exhausted, covered in mud from helping other storm victims, and emotionally drained from 3 days of crisis management without any support from my sister. The volunteer, a kind woman named Lisa Parker, looked up our family information in their computer system and immediately frowned. "Ma'am, I'm seeing some conflicting information here. You're Maya Rodriguez, correct? And your family evacuated from Seawall Boulevard." I nodded, wondering what kind of paperwork error might have occurred during the chaos of the storm response. Lisa looked at her screen again, then back at me with obvious confusion. "According to our records, your sister Sofia Rodriguez Chen contacted us on Wednesday afternoon to register your entire family as safely evacuated to her home in the woodlands. She provided your parents' names, your name and even your apartment address, confirming that everyone had been accounted for and was staying with family members outside the evacuation zone." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. "That's impossible," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been at Memorial High School shelter since Wednesday evening with my parents. My father is currently in the hospital because his condition deteriorated during the storm. Sofia never came to evacuate us." Lisa's expression shifted from confusion to concern, as she realized she was witnessing something far more serious than a simple paperwork error. "Ma'am, we've been trying to reach you for 72 hours. Your sister registered your address as evacuated with family, but you're clearly not with family." She pulled up more details on her screen, showing me the official record Sofia had created. She called Wednesday at 3:47 p.m., spoke with our intake coordinator, and provided detailed information about your family's evacuation status. She even gave us her home address and contact information as your temporary location. The full scope of Sofia's betrayal began to sink in. Not only had she abandoned our family during a life-threatening emergency, but she had actively lied to authorities about our safety status. By falsely reporting that we had evacuated with her, she had prevented the Red Cross from conducting welfare checks or providing assistance that we desperately needed. Her lie had essentially erased us from the emergency response system at the exact moment when we needed help the most. Lisa printed out the documentation for me, and I stared at the paper with growing anger and disbelief. Sofia's name, her phone number, her address in the Woodlands, and her false claim that the entire Rodriguez family was safely sheltering at her home. The timestamp showed that she had made this call during the same hours when I was desperately trying to reach her, when I was begging for her help evacuating our dying father, when she was telling me that work obligations prevented her from fulfilling her family responsibilities. What does this mean? I asked Lisa, though I was beginning to understand the implications. If she reported us as evacuated, what happened to any assistance we might have received? Lisa's expression grew more grave, as she explained that families reported as safely evacuated with relatives were removed from priority assistance lists. Resources were redirected to families who appeared to have no support system, while we were assumed to be safe and comfortable in Sofia's home. The Red Cross had protocols for checking on vulnerable populations during and after disasters, but those protocols relied on accurate information from family members. Sofia's false report had effectively made our family invisible to emergency services during our greatest time of need. While we struggled in an overcrowded shelter with inadequate medical support for Dad's condition, the Red Cross believed we were safe, comfortable and well cared for in a suburban home 45 minutes away from the disaster zone. Standing in that Red Cross center, holding the printed documentation of Sofia's deception, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The sister I had loved and defended my entire life had not only abandoned our family during our darkest hour, but had actively worked to ensure we would receive no help from anyone else. The weight of this realization was almost unbearable, but it was also clarifying in a way that nothing else had ever been. For the first time in my life, I saw Sofia exactly as she was, not as I had always hoped she could be. Lisa Parker, the Red Cross volunteer, could see the shock and pain written across my face. She had been working disaster relief for over a decade, and had witnessed many family tragedies, but something about this particular situation seemed to affect her deeply. "Ma'am, I need you to know that this isn't just a paperwork error. What your sister did could have had serious consequences beyond your family. When someone provides false evacuation information, it affects resource allocation for an entire disaster response." She explained that the Red Cross had limited personnel and supplies during major disasters, and they relied on accurate family reporting to determine where help was most needed. By claiming our family was safely evacuated, Sofia had essentially stolen resources that could have been directed toward our actual emergency situation. Other families in similar circumstances might have received priority assistance that we were denied, because Sofia wanted to maintain the appearance that she was fulfilling her family obligations, while actually pursuing her own interests. The documentation showed that Sofia had been remarkably thorough in her deception. She had provided our full names, ages and even mentioned Dad's medical condition, claiming that he was receiving appropriate care at her home. She had given detailed information about her address, ensuring that any follow-up calls would reach her rather than us. Most disturbing of all, she had specifically requested that our Galveston address be marked as
Confirmed evacuated, preventing any welfare checks that might have revealed her lie. Lisa helped me understand the full scope of what this meant for our family's experience during the hurricane. The Red Cross maintained lists of vulnerable populations who needed priority assistance during disasters, and Dad's cancer diagnosis should have placed our family high on that list. Instead, Sofia's false report had removed us from consideration entirely. While we were struggling in an inadequate shelter with deteriorating medical support, emergency coordinators believed we were safe and comfortable, receiving proper care for Dad's condition. Walking out of the Red Cross Center that afternoon, I felt like I was seeing my entire life through new eyes. Every family gathering where Sofia had been praised as the successful daughter while I was taken for granted. Every crisis where I had carried the burden alone while she provided only token support. Every promise she had made about being more involved, more present, more committed to sharing family responsibilities. All of it had been leading to this moment when her true priorities would be revealed under the pressure of a genuine emergency. The drive back to the hospital where Dad was recovering gave me time to process the enormity of what had happened. Sofia hadn't just failed to help during a hurricane, she had actively sabotaged our ability to receive help from anyone else. She had prioritized maintaining her image as a caring daughter over our actual safety and well-being. The sophistication of her deception suggested that this wasn't a panicked, last-minute decision but a calculated choice to protect her own interests while ensuring that no one would discover her abandonment. Dad was awake when I returned to his hospital room, looking frailer than ever but alert enough to notice my emotional state. "Mija, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I sat beside his bed, still holding the Red Cross documentation, trying to decide how much of the truth I should share with him. His condition was fragile, and the stress of learning about Sofia's betrayal could potentially worsen his health. But I also couldn't continue protecting him from the reality of who his golden daughter really was. Mom was resting in the chair beside Dad's bed, exhausted from 3 days of sleeping in uncomfortable shelter conditions followed by hospital waiting rooms. She stirred when she heard us talking and immediately noticed the papers in my hands. "What's that, honey? Is that something from the insurance company?" I looked between my parents, these two people who had sacrificed everything to build a better life for their daughters, and realized that they deserved to know the truth about how one of those daughters had repaid their devotion. Slowly, carefully, I explained what I had discovered at the Red Cross Center. I showed them the documentation proving that Sofia had contacted emergency officials to report our family as safely evacuated while she knew we were actually facing the hurricane in an emergency shelter. I watched as the information sank in, as they began to understand that their elder daughter had not been delayed by work obligations but had made a conscious choice to abandon us while covering her tracks. Dad's reaction was heartbreaking. He didn't express anger or disappointment but seemed to retreat inward, as if trying to process how the daughter he had loved and trusted could have betrayed the family during their greatest need. "There must be some explanation," he said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sofia wouldn't intentionally deceive us. Maybe she thought we had already evacuated. Maybe there was some misunderstanding." But Mom's response was different. Carmen Rodriguez had spent 30 years raising two daughters, and she had always possessed an intuitive understanding of their personalities that Dad sometimes missed. As I explained the timeline and the specific details of Sofia's deception, I could see recognition dawning in her eyes. This wasn't completely surprising to her. It was confirmation of suspicions she had harbored but never voiced. "Miguel," she said to Dad, her voice heavy with sadness, "this explains why Sofia hasn't called since the hurricane. She knows what she did. She's probably hoping we never find out, that we'll just assume she couldn't get through because of storm damage to communication systems." The three of us sat in silence for several minutes, each processing the implications of this betrayal in our own way. Over the next few hours, as Dad rested and Mom and I took turns keeping vigil beside his bed, I began to understand the deeper patterns that had led to this moment. Sofia had spent her entire adult life crafting an image of success and responsibility while actually avoiding the difficult realities of family obligation. She had learned to use grand gestures and expensive gifts to maintain the appearance of devotion while leaving the actual work of care to others. Her marriage to David had only reinforced these tendencies. Their comfortable lifestyle in the woodlands represented everything Sofia valued: financial security, social status, and distance from the messy complications of family crisis. When Hurricane Isabella forced her to choose between protecting that lifestyle and fulfilling her family obligations, she had chosen her own comfort while ensuring that her abandonment would remain hidden. The hospital social worker, Mrs. Jennifer Martinez, stopped by that evening to check on our family's post-disaster needs. She was a kind woman in her 40s who had been helping hurricane victims navigate the complex systems of emergency assistance and insurance claims. When she learned about our situation and the Red Cross documentation, her professional demeanor shifted to something more personal and concerned. "This is actually quite serious," she explained after reviewing the papers I had brought from the Red Cross Center. "False reporting to emergency services during a declared disaster can have legal implications. More importantly, it may have affected your family's eligibility for certain types of federal assistance. When someone reports a family as safely evacuated, it changes how that family's needs are assessed by multiple agencies." She went on to explain that FEMA, insurance companies, and charitable organizations all relied on initial disaster reports to determine aid distribution. Sofia's lie had potentially impacted not just our immediate emergency response but our long-term recovery assistance as well. The Red Cross documentation would need to be corrected with multiple agencies, and the process could take weeks or even months to fully resolve. That night, sleeping in the hospital recliner beside Dad's bed, I dreamed about our childhood. In my dream, Sofia and I were young again, playing in the backyard of our house on Seawall Boulevard. But even in the dream, there was something wrong. Every time we built something together, a sand castle or a fort, Sofia would knock it down and blame someone else when our parents came to investigate. I woke up around 3 in the morning with the unsettling realization that maybe Sofia's betrayal wasn't as surprising as I had initially thought. The next morning brought our first direct contact with Sofia since before the hurricane. She called Dad's hospital room phone, her voice bright and cheerful as if nothing unusual had happened. Dad, thank goodness I finally got through to you. I've been trying to reach you for days, but all the phone lines have been down. David and I have been so worried about you and Mom and Maya. How are you? Are you okay? Dad, still weak and confused about the magnitude of Sofia's deception, began to explain where we had been and what we had endured. But before he could finish, Sofia interrupted with a flood of explanations and excuses. She had been trapped in Houston by flooded roads. Her office building had lost power and communication. David's company had required all employees to remain on site during the emergency. She made it sound as if she had been a victim of the hurricane rather than someone who had chosen to prioritize work over family. I took the phone from Dad, no longer willing to watch him struggle to understand Sofia's version of events. Sofia, we need to talk. Not about the hurricane, not about your work emergencies, but about what you did to us. There was a long pause before she responded, and when she did, her tone had shifted from cheerful to defensive. What I did? Maya, what are you talking about? I explained that we couldn't get away from Houston because of the emergency situations at work. David and I felt terrible about it, but there was nothing we could do. We assumed you would take Mom and Dad to the shelter, which is exactly what you did. Everything worked out fine. Everything did not work out fine, Sofia. Dad is in the hospital because the stress of the shelter worsened his condition. But that's not even the biggest problem. I know about the call you made to the Red Cross. Another pause, longer this time, and I could practically hear Sofia's mind racing as she tried to figure out how much I knew. What call? I don't know what you're talking about. But her voice had lost its confident tone, and I could detect the uncertainty that meant she was scrambling to maintain her deception. The call where you reported our entire family as safely evacuated to your home in the woodlands. The call where you provided detailed information to emergency officials, claiming that we were all with you when you knew perfectly well that we were facing a Category 4 hurricane alone. The call that prevented us from receiving any emergency assistance because everyone believed we were safe. The silence stretched so long that I thought Sofia might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Maya, I can explain. It's not what you think. I was trying to help, to make sure that you wouldn't be bothered by unnecessary welfare checks during the storm. I thought it would be easier for everyone if the authorities believed you were with family. The sheer audacity of this explanation left me momentarily speechless. Sofia was actually trying to frame her betrayal as a favor, as if lying to emergency services during a disaster was somehow for our benefit. Sofia, Dad is dying. He spent 3 days in an emergency shelter that was completely inappropriate for his condition because you abandoned us. And then you made sure that no one would come to help us by lying about our situation. I didn't abandon you, Maya. I had obligations that I couldn't walk away from. You're perfectly capable of handling family emergencies. You've been doing it for years. I just made sure that you wouldn't be bothered by outside interference while you took care of things. The casual dismissal in her tone, the assumption that managing our family's hurricane evacuation was simply my responsibility rather than something we should have shared, crystallized everything that was wrong with our relationship. Sofia, do you understand that what you did was illegal? That false reporting to emergency services during a declared disaster is a crime? That your lie could have cost Dad his life if his condition had deteriorated faster than it did? I was no longer trying to control my anger, and my raised voice drew concerned looks from the hospital staff. Don't be so dramatic, Maya. Dad is fine, you handled everything perfectly well without my help, and no real harm was done. Sometimes families have to make difficult choices during emergencies, and everyone did what they needed to do. I protected my career and my marriage. You took care of Mom and Dad, and everything worked out in the end. That phrase, everything worked out in the end, became the moment when I finally understood that Sofia was incapable of genuine remorse or accountability. In her mind, as long as she had avoided consequences for her choices, our family's suffering was irrelevant. She had calculated that she could abandon us, lie to cover her tracks, and then return to her comfortable life without any real repercussions. The conversation ended with Sofia promising to visit the hospital later that week, though her tone suggested she viewed this as an unpleasant obligation rather than a genuine desire to support our father's recovery. After hanging up, I sat beside Dad's bed, trying to process the full scope of what our family had lost. It wasn't just Sofia's absence during the hurricane, it was the realization that the sister I had loved and defended my entire life had never really existed. Dad had dozed off during my phone conversation with Sofia, but Mom had been listening to every word. When I turned to her, I saw that she was crying quietly. Not from shock, but from the pain of having her worst fears confirmed. I always knew, she said softly. I always knew that Sofia cared more about herself than about family, but I hoped that when it really mattered, she would prove me wrong. The next few days at the hospital gave me time to fully understand how Sofia's abandonment had affected not just our immediate crisis but our entire family dynamic. For years I had enabled her self-centered behavior by covering for her absences, making excuses for her lack of involvement, and shouldering burdens that should have been shared. I had been so invested in maintaining the fiction of a close family that I had ignored clear evidence of Sofia's true character. Aunt Elena, Mom's younger sister, arrived from San Antonio on the fourth day after the hurricane. She had driven through still dangerous conditions to check on our family, bringing supplies, emotional support, and a perspective that helped clarify the situation. Elena had always been the family member who spoke truth directly, without the diplomatic softening that others used to avoid confrontation. After I explained what had happened with Sofia and showed her the Red Cross documentation, Elena's reaction was immediate and unambiguous. That girl has always been selfish, but this goes beyond selfishness. This is betrayal of the worst kind, abandoning family during a life-threatening emergency, and then lying to cover her tracks. Your parents raised her better than this, but somewhere along the way, she decided that her comfort was more important than family loyalty. Elena had watched Sofia's behavior over the years with growing concern, and she had tried to warn our parents that their elder daughter was developing a pattern of taking without giving, of making promises she had no intention of keeping. But like many parents, Mom and Dad had wanted to believe the best about their children, and they had dismissed Elena's concerns as family jealousy or misunderstanding. Maya, you need to understand that what Sofia did wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. It was a calculated decision to protect herself at your family's expense. The fact that she called the Red Cross to report you as evacuated shows that she planned this abandonment and took steps to ensure she wouldn't face consequences for it. That level of deception requires forethought and intent. Elena's words helped me understand that my hurt and anger were not only justified but necessary. For too long, I had excused Sofia's behavior, found explanations for her selfishness, and shouldered extra responsibility to compensate for her lack of involvement. But Hurricane Isabella had revealed the true extent of her willingness to sacrifice family well-being for personal convenience. As Dad's hospital stay extended into its second week, the practical consequences of Sofia's betrayal continued to unfold. Insurance adjusters questioned why our family had been reported as evacuated when we were clearly storm victims requiring assistance. FEMA representatives needed additional documentation to verify our actual storm experience versus the false reports in their system. Charitable organizations had already allocated resources based on the assumption that we had family support when we actually had none. Each phone call, each form, each meeting with disaster relief officials required me to explain Sofia's deception and provide evidence that contradicted the false information she had provided. The process was emotionally exhausting and practically complicated, adding layers of bureaucratic burden to an already devastating situation. Every time I had to recount the story, I felt the betrayal fresh, like reopening a wound that was trying to heal. But perhaps the most painful aspect was watching Dad struggle to reconcile his image of Sofia with the reality of what she had done. He had spent his entire life believing in the fundamental goodness of both his daughters, and accepting that one of them was capable of such calculated selfishness challenged everything he thought he knew about family loyalty and parental success. During one of our quiet moments together in his hospital room, Dad took my hand with his weakened grip and looked at me with tears in his eyes. Mija, I failed as a father. I raised a daughter who could abandon her family during our greatest need. How did I not see this coming? How did I not teach her better? I squeezed his hand gently, feeling the weight of his guilt and disappointment. Dad, you didn't fail. You and Mom raised us with the same values, the same love, the same expectations. Sofia made her own choices about what kind of person she wanted to be. You can't blame yourself for decisions she made as an adult. But even as I tried to comfort him, I understood his struggle. Parents invest everything in their children, believing that love and guidance will produce adults who share their values and priorities. Discovering that one child has rejected those foundational principles feels like a fundamental failure of the parenting process, even when the parent has done everything right. The day before Dad was finally released from the hospital, Sofia made her promised visit. She arrived carrying expensive flowers and a basket of gourmet food items, gifts that seemed designed more to impress the hospital staff than to provide meaningful comfort to our family. Her demeanor was artificially bright, as if she could overcome the gravity of her betrayal through sheer force of personality. "Dad, you look so much better. I've been worried sick about you. I brought some of those cookies you love from that bakery in Houston, and Mom, I picked up some of your favorite tea." She moved around the room arranging flowers and distributing gifts, maintaining a constant stream of cheerful chatter that prevented anyone else from speaking. When she finally paused, Dad looked at her with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger or disappointment, but something sadder and more final. "Sofia, we need to talk about what happened during the hurricane. About the choices you made and what they meant for our family." Sofia's bright smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Dad, I explained all of that to Maya. There were circumstances beyond my control that prevented David and me from getting to Galveston. We felt terrible about it, but sometimes life forces you to make difficult decisions. The important thing is that everyone is okay now." "Everyone is not okay, Sofia." Dad's voice was quiet but firm. "I spent 3 days in an emergency shelter that worsened my condition because my daughter chose her career over my health. Your mother slept on a concrete floor while you were comfortable in your suburban home. Maya handled a family crisis alone because the person who promised to share that responsibility decided her work was more important." Sofia began to protest, to offer more explanations and justifications, but Dad held up his hand to stop her. "I'm not finished, Mija. What hurts most isn't that you couldn't come to help us. It's that you lied to the Red Cross to cover up your absence. You actively prevented us from receiving assistance that we desperately needed. You sacrificed our safety to protect your image." The room fell silent as Sofia realized that we knew the full extent of her deception. For a moment her carefully constructed facade cracked, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been shame or regret. But it was quickly replaced by defensiveness and self-justification. "I was trying to protect you from bureaucratic interference during a crisis. I thought it would be easier if officials believed you were with family rather than bothering you with unnecessary checks and procedures. Everything I did was meant to help, not hurt." Even in the face of undeniable evidence, Sofia was still trying to frame her betrayal as a favor. Dad closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there was a finality in his expression that I recognized. He had made a decision about something, and I sensed that our family would never be the same. "Sofia, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. I am dying. The doctors estimate I have months, not years. In whatever time I have left, I want to be surrounded by people who put family first, who keep their promises, who can be trusted during the worst moments of life." Sofia started to speak, but Dad continued. "You have shown me that you are not that kind of person. You prioritize your own comfort over family loyalty. You make promises you have no intention of keeping. And when faced with a choice between helping your family and protecting yourself, you choose yourself every time." The words hit Sofia like physical blows, and for the first time since her arrival, she seemed genuinely shaken. "Dad, you don't mean that. I made a mistake, but I'm still your daughter. I love you and Mom and Maya. One bad decision doesn't erase 32 years of being your daughter." It wasn't one bad decision, Sofia. It was a pattern of behavior that reached its logical conclusion during the hurricane. For years Maya has been carrying burdens that should have been shared between you. For years you've been making promises about being more involved while actually becoming less involved. The hurricane just revealed what was already true about your character. Mom, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. "Sofia, your father is right. We've been making excuses for your selfishness for years, telling ourselves that you cared but were just busy, that you would be there when it really mattered. But when it really mattered, you abandoned us and then lied to cover your tracks." I watched Sofia struggle to process what was happening. She had expected to visit the hospital, distribute some gifts, offer a few explanations, and return to her comfortable life without serious consequences. Instead, she was facing the complete breakdown of her family relationships and the exposure of her true character. "What are you saying? That you're disowning me? That I'm not part of this family anymore?" Her voice carried a note of panic as she began to understand that her actions had finally produced consequences she couldn't charm or explain away. Dad's response was gentle but uncompromising. "I'm saying that family membership requires more than shared DNA. It requires loyalty, sacrifice, and keeping your promises to the people who love you. You've shown that you're not willing or able to do those things. So while you'll always be my biological daughter, you've chosen not to be part of this family in any meaningful way." The silence that followed Dad's words stretched through the hospital room like a physical presence. Sofia stood frozen beside his bed, her expensive flowers forgotten in her hands, as the full weight of his rejection settled over her. For the first time in her adult life, she was facing consequences that she couldn't talk her way out of, circumstances that her charm and excuses couldn't smooth over. The golden daughter who had always been forgiven, always been welcomed back regardless of her behavior, was being held accountable in a way that shattered her understanding of how family relationships worked. Mom reached over and took Dad's hand, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes about where her loyalties lay. After 35 years of marriage, Carmen Rodriguez had learned to trust her husband's judgment about people and situations, and she could see the wisdom in his decision, even though it broke her heart. Sofia was her firstborn, the daughter she had dreamed about and planned for, but she was also the daughter who had proven herself capable of unthinkable selfishness when her family needed
her most. "Mom," Sofia said, turning toward our mother with desperation in her voice, "you can't agree with this. Yes, I made mistakes during the hurricane, but I'm still your daughter. I still love this family. One crisis doesn't erase everything we've built together over 3 decades." Her voice cracked as she spoke, revealing genuine emotion beneath the polished exterior she usually maintained. But Mom's response was measured and firm, reflecting weeks of painful reflection about Sofia's character and choices. "Mija, love isn't just a feeling you claim to have. Love is what you do when someone needs you, how you prioritize their well-being over your own comfort, whether you keep the promises you make when times get difficult. During the worst crisis our family has ever faced, you showed us that your version of love doesn't include sacrifice or reliability." The conversation that followed was unlike anything our family had ever experienced. For years we had operated under an unspoken agreement that Sofia's selfishness would be overlooked, explained away, or compensated for by others. Dad and Mom had made excuses for her absence during important family events. I had covered for her when she failed to follow through on commitments. Everyone had adjusted their expectations to accommodate her limitations rather than holding her accountable for meeting basic family obligations. But the hurricane had changed everything. The life and death nature of the crisis had stripped away the comfortable illusions we had maintained about Sofia's character and forced us to confront the reality of who she actually was versus who we had wanted her to be. There was no longer any way to minimize or rationalize her behavior because the consequences had been too severe and the deception too deliberate. Sofia tried multiple approaches to regain her footing in the conversation. She attempted to shift blame to David, claiming that his work emergency had created pressure she couldn't resist. She suggested that I had been unfair in my expectations, that I should have been capable of handling the evacuation alone. She even hinted that our parents were being unreasonable in their disappointment, that families everywhere had made difficult choices during the hurricane and most people would understand her position. Each attempt at deflection revealed more about Sofia's fundamental inability to accept responsibility for her actions. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of the harm she had caused and the deliberate nature of her deception, she continued to search for ways to avoid accountability. The Red Cross documentation was dismissed as bureaucratic confusion. Dad's deteriorated health was characterized as an unfortunate but unforeseeable consequence. My emotional distress was portrayed as an overreaction to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Watching this performance, I began to understand that Sofia's problem wasn't simply selfishness or poor judgment in a moment of crisis. It was a deeper character flaw that prevented her from acknowledging when her actions hurt other people. She seemed genuinely unable to comprehend that her choices had moral dimensions beyond their impact on her own life. The concept that she owed something to her family, that she had obligations that superseded her personal preferences, appeared to be completely foreign to her thinking. Dad, despite his physical weakness, maintained remarkable clarity and strength during this confrontation. His cancer diagnosis had taught him to value authenticity over comfort, truth over diplomatic silence. With limited time remaining, he had no patience for the kinds of polite fictions that had allowed Sofia's behavior to continue unchallenged for so many years. "Sofia, I want you to understand something very clearly," he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "This isn't about punishment or anger, this is about accepting reality. You've shown us who you are when faced with genuine crisis, and that person is not someone we can trust or rely on.
Pretending otherwise would be unfair to everyone involved, including you. The hospital room fell silent again as Sofia processed this statement. She had entered expecting forgiveness, understanding, and a gradual return to normal family relationships. Instead, she was being presented with a permanent change in her status within the family, consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate aftermath of the hurricane. "What does this mean exactly?" she asked, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "Are you saying I can't visit you anymore, that I'm not welcome at family gatherings? That you're cutting me out of your lives completely?" The questions revealed her growing understanding that this wasn't a temporary punishment but a fundamental restructuring of family relationships based on demonstrated character rather than biological connection. Dad considered his response carefully, and I could see him weighing his words to ensure they accurately reflected his intentions. "It means that we're no longer going to pretend that you're someone you're not. We're not going to save your place at family gatherings when you choose not to attend. We're not going to include you in emergency planning when you've proven unreliable during emergencies. We're not going to factor your needs and preferences into major family decisions when you've shown that you don't consider our needs in your decisions." This explanation seemed to hit Sofia harder than outright rejection might have. Dad wasn't disowning her completely, but he was removing her from the inner circle of family trust and consideration. She would no longer be consulted about important matters, no longer be assumed to participate in family events, no longer be given the benefit of the doubt when conflicts arose. Her status would be determined by her actions rather than her intentions or promises. Mom added her own perspective to Dad's explanation, speaking with the sadness of a parent who had finally accepted painful truths about her child. "Sofia, for years we've been waiting for you to grow into the daughter we believed you could be. We've made excuses for your selfishness, covered for your absences, and adjusted our expectations to accommodate your limitations. But the hurricane showed us that you're not going to change, and we can't continue to enable behavior that hurts our family." The word enable seemed to particularly sting Sofia, who had always viewed her family's accommodations as evidence of their love, rather than as unhealthy patterns that allowed her selfishness to continue without consequences. She had become comfortable with a dynamic where others compensated for her failures, where her promises were accepted despite her track record, where her participation was hoped for but never required. "I can change," Sofia said desperately. "I know I made mistakes, but I can do better. I can be more involved, more reliable, more committed to putting family first. Give me another chance to prove that I've learned from this experience." But even as she spoke these words, they rang hollow. She had made similar promises many times before, during smaller crises and disappointments, and had never followed through with sustained behavioral change. Dad shook his head slowly, not with anger but with the exhaustion of someone who had finally stopped hoping for something that was never going to happen. "Sofia, you're 32 years old. If you were going to develop genuine concern for other people's well-being, it would have happened by now. The hurricane didn't reveal a temporary lapse in judgment, it revealed your actual character when external pressures forced you to choose between yourself and your family." The truth of this statement was undeniable. Sofia's abandonment during the hurricane hadn't been aberrant behavior, but the logical culmination of patterns that had been developing for years. Her increasing distance from family obligations, her tendency to prioritize career and social advancement over family needs, her skill at making promises she had no intention of keeping, all of these had been leading toward exactly the kind of choice she had made when Hurricane Isabella forced her to decide what really mattered to her. As the conversation continued, I found myself watching Sofia with a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the sister I had thought I had, for the family unity I had believed in, for the loss of illusions that had shaped my understanding of our relationships for decades. But also relief that the truth was finally out in the open, that we were no longer pretending that Sofia was someone she wasn't, that I was no longer alone in recognizing the problems that had been obvious to me for years. The relief was particularly strong when I realized that Dad's decision meant I would no longer be expected to compensate for Sofia's failures or cover for her absences. For my entire adult life, I had been the daughter who picked up the slack when Sofia didn't follow through, who managed family crises when Sofia was unavailable, who provided the emotional labor that Sofia promised but never delivered. Dad's acknowledgement of Sofia's true character freed me from the obligation to continue enabling her behavior. Elena, who had been quietly observing this family confrontation from her chair in the corner, finally spoke up with the practical wisdom that had always characterized her approach to difficult situations. "Sofia, honey, your parents aren't trying to hurt you. They're trying to protect themselves and Maya from being disappointed again. You've trained them to expect certain things from you, and those expectations have been consistently harmful to their well-being." Elena's perspective carried weight because she had watched our family dynamics from the outside for years, offering support during crises but never becoming enmeshed in the patterns of accommodation and excuse-making that had developed around Sofia's behavior. Her observations were clear-eyed and uncompromised by the emotional investments that made it difficult for immediate family members to see situations objectively. "The problem isn't that you're a bad person, Sofia. The problem is that you're not the person your family needs you to be, and pretending otherwise has been hurting everyone involved. Your parents spend energy worrying about your reaction to family decisions instead of focusing on what's actually best for the family. Maya carries extra responsibility because everyone knows you won't follow through on commitments. Everyone walks on eggshells to avoid acknowledging obvious problems with your behavior." This analysis seemed to surprise Sofia, who had apparently never considered how her selfishness affected the family's overall functioning. She had focused on maintaining her image as a caring daughter while remaining oblivious to the ways her unreliability forced others to adjust their behavior and expectations. The idea that her family had been protecting her from consequences while absorbing those consequences themselves appeared to be a completely new perspective for her. "I never asked anyone to cover for me," Sofia protested, revealing her fundamental misunderstanding of how family relationships work. "If Maya chose to take on extra responsibilities, that was her decision. If Mom and Dad chose to worry about my reactions, that was their choice. I never demanded special treatment or asked anyone to make accommodations for me." This response crystallized everything that was wrong with Sofia's approach to family relationships. She had benefited enormously from other people's accommodations while maintaining that she had never requested those accommodations. She had allowed others to compensate for her failures, while claiming that she wasn't responsible for their choice to provide that compensation. She had enjoyed the privileges of family membership while rejecting the obligations that came with those privileges. Dad's final statement to Sofia carried the weight of his 35 years as a husband and father, his understanding of what family loyalty actually meant, and his acceptance of his own mortality. "Mija, I love you because you're my daughter, and that will never change. But love doesn't mean pretending that harmful behavior is acceptable. It doesn't mean enabling selfishness or ignoring patterns that hurt the people we care about. Sometimes love means accepting difficult truths and adjusting our relationships accordingly." Sofia left the hospital that day without the reconciliation she had expected, without the forgiveness she had taken for granted, and without the family status she had assumed would always be available to her regardless of her behavior. The expensive flowers remained on Dad's bedside table, a reminder of her attempt to purchase her way back into good standing without addressing the fundamental character issues that had led to her exile. The weeks that followed Dad's release from the hospital brought a strange kind of peace to our family dynamics. Without the constant tension of accommodating Sofia's selfishness or managing her reactions to family decisions, we were able to focus on what really mattered: Dad's health, Mom's emotional well-being, and the practical challenges of post-hurricane recovery. The absence of Sofia's drama and unreliability created space for more authentic relationships among the family members who had proven their commitment through action rather than words. Dad's condition continued to deteriorate, but he faced his declining health with remarkable grace and acceptance. The stress of managing Sofia's behavior and maintaining family harmony, despite her selfishness, had been removed from his daily concerns, allowing him to use his remaining energy for relationships that brought him joy rather than frustration. Mom seemed lighter somehow, freed from the exhausting work of making excuses for Sofia's behavior and mediating between her daughter's conflicting approaches to family obligation. For me, the changes were even more profound. I had spent so many years carrying extra responsibility to compensate for Sofia's unreliability that I had forgotten what it felt like to have my own efforts acknowledged rather than taken for granted. With Sofia no longer part of our family's inner circle, Mom and Dad began expressing appreciation for my years of dedicated care, recognizing sacrifices they had previously overlooked because they were focused on trying to maintain Sofia's involvement. The practical aspects of post-hurricane recovery also proceeded more smoothly without Sofia's involvement. Insurance claims were processed based on accurate information rather than the conflicting reports that Sofia's deception had created. FEMA assistance was allocated appropriately once the Red Cross documentation was corrected, and our actual storm experience was properly recorded. Charitable organizations were able to provide targeted help because they understood our real situation rather than the false narrative Sofia had constructed. Elena became an even more important part of our family structure, stepping into some of the emotional and practical roles that we had hoped Sofia would fill. She helped with medical appointments, provided companionship for Mom during Dad's difficult days, and offered the kind of reliable support that family members should provide for each other. Her presence was a reminder that family relationships could be based on mutual care and genuine commitment rather than obligation and guilt. During this period, Sofia made several attempts to re-establish contact and repair the damage caused by her behavior during the hurricane. She sent cards and letters expressing remorse for her choices and promising to do better in the future. She made phone calls asking about Dad's health and offering to help with various aspects of his care. She even showed up unannounced at our parents' house on a few occasions, hoping to gradually work her way back into family gatherings through persistence and apparent concern. But Dad and Mom remained firm in their decision to maintain boundaries with Sofia. They were polite but distant during her phone calls, acknowledged her cards without responding emotionally, and declined her offers of help while explaining that they had developed support systems that didn't include her. The consistency of their response sent a clear message that Sofia's exile from the family's inner circle wasn't a temporary punishment but a permanent adjustment based on demonstrated character rather than hopeful expectations. One of Sofia's letters particularly revealed her continued inability to understand the gravity of what she had done or accept responsibility for the consequences of her actions. She wrote about the hurricane as a misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion by everyone's emotions during a stressful time. She characterized her false report to the Red Cross as a communication error rather than deliberate deception. She suggested that the family's response to her behavior was unfairly harsh and motivated by unrealistic expectations about what anyone could have done in such challenging circumstances. Reading this letter, I understood that Sofia remained fundamentally unchanged by the experience. She had not developed greater empathy for the family members she had abandoned, deeper understanding of the harm caused by her deception, or genuine remorse for prioritizing her own comfort over our safety. Instead, she had constructed a narrative that minimized her responsibility and portrayed herself as a victim of circumstances and unreasonable family expectations. This realization removed any lingering doubt I might have had about Dad's decision to restructure Sofia's role in our family. Some people learn from their mistakes and grow into better versions of themselves when faced with consequences for harmful behavior. Others simply become more sophisticated in their attempts to avoid accountability while continuing the same patterns of selfishness and deception. Sofia had clearly chosen the latter path, confirming that Dad's assessment of her character had been accurate and necessary. The approaching Christmas season brought our new family dynamics into sharp focus. Previous years had involved careful negotiations about Sofia's availability, complicated logistics to accommodate her schedule, and inevitable disappointments when she canceled plans at the last minute or failed to follow through on commitments. This year, we made plans based on the people who had proven their reliability and commitment, creating celebrations that were smaller but more authentic. Dad's deteriorating health meant that this would likely be his last Christmas, and we wanted it to be meaningful rather than stressful. Elena helped coordinate a gathering that focused on comfort and genuine connection rather than the performative family unity we had tried to maintain in previous years. The absence of Sofia's drama and unreliability allowed us to create exactly the kind of peaceful, loving environment that Dad needed during his final holiday season. Sofia learned about our Christmas plans through mutual family friends and made several attempts to insert herself into the celebration. She called asking about timing and locations, sent gifts for family members with notes expressing her desire to participate, and even contacted Elena asking her to intercede on her behalf with Mom and Dad. But each attempt was politely but firmly declined, with clear explanations that our Christmas plans didn't include her participation. The clarity of these boundaries was actually kinder than the ambiguous accommodations we had made in previous years. Instead of leaving Sofia wondering whether she was welcome or expected, we gave her definitive information that allowed her to make her own plans rather than hoping for an invitation that wasn't coming. The honesty was initially painful for everyone involved, but it prevented the kinds of last-minute conflicts and disappointments that had characterized previous family gatherings. On Christmas Eve, as our small family gathered in our parents' living room, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the difficult decisions Dad had made following the hurricane. The people present were the people who had proven their commitment through action rather than words. The relationships were based on mutual care and genuine affection rather than obligation and guilt. The atmosphere was peaceful and authentic rather than tense and performative. Dad, despite his physical frailty, seemed more content than he had been in years. The removal of stress related to Sofia's behavior had allowed him to focus his remaining energy on relationships that brought him joy rather than frustration. Mom appeared more relaxed and present, freed from the exhausting work of managing Sofia's reactions and mediating family conflicts. Elena's presence provided exactly the kind of warm, reliable support that enhanced rather than complicated our family dynamics. As we sat together that evening, sharing stories and memories while Dad dozed peacefully in his favorite chair, I realized that the hurricane had ultimately given our family an unexpected gift. By forcing Sofia to reveal her true character and priorities, Hurricane Isabella had cleared away illusions that had been preventing us from building authentic relationships based on who people actually were, rather than who we hoped they might become. The storm had been devastating in many ways, causing physical damage, health complications, and emotional trauma that would take years to fully process. But it had also provided the clarity we needed to create family relationships based on truth rather than wishful thinking, on demonstrated character rather than biological connection, on mutual care rather than one-sided accommodation. In losing the sister I thought I had gained the family I actually needed. 8 months after Hurricane Isabella devastated our lives and revealed truths that changed everything, I stood in the Red Cross Volunteer Training Center in downtown Houston, wearing the official vest that marked me as a certified disaster response coordinator. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same organization that had exposed Sofia's betrayal was now where I was channeling my passion for helping families during their darkest moments. Lisa Parker, the volunteer who had first shown me the documentation of Sofia's deception, had become my mentor, and eventually convinced me to join their disaster response team. Maya, you understand better than most volunteers what families go through during major emergencies, Lisa had explained during my recruitment interview. Your experience with Hurricane Isabella, both the crisis itself and discovering how emergency systems can be manipulated, gives you insights that could help other families avoid similar situations. She was right. Every family I worked with reminded me of how vulnerable people become during disasters, how much they rely on accurate information and reliable support systems. Dad had passed away 3 months earlier, on a quiet Tuesday morning in April, while sitting in his favorite chair, overlooking the Gulf waters he had loved his entire life. His final weeks had been exactly what he had hoped for, peaceful, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about his well-being, free from the drama and stress that had characterized so many previous family gatherings. Mom Elena and I had been with him when he died, sharing stories and holding his hands as he slipped away with the kind of dignity he had always possessed. Sofia had attempted to attend the funeral, arriving at the church despite not being invited and creating exactly the kind of scene that Dad would have hated. She positioned herself in the back of the church, crying dramatically and making her grief visible to everyone present, as if her public display of sorrow could somehow compensate for her absence during Dad's final months. Several family friends, unaware of the circumstances that had led to her exclusion from family gatherings, approached her with sympathy and condolences, which she accepted as if she had been a devoted daughter throughout his illness. Mom had prepared for this possibility, understanding that Sofia might try to insert herself into
Dad's funeral regardless of their estrangement. She had asked Elena and me to handle any disruption quietly and diplomatically, ensuring that the service remained focused on celebrating Dad's life rather than managing Sofia's behavior. When Sofia approached the family receiving line after the service, Elena gently but firmly explained that her presence was inappropriate given the circumstances, and she was asked to leave. The confrontation was brief but revealing. Sofia expressed outrage that she was being excluded from her own father's funeral, claiming that biological relationships superseded any family conflicts and that death should bring forgiveness and reconciliation. But her arguments carried no weight with family members who understood the full scope of her betrayal and had witnessed her continued refusal to accept responsibility for her actions. She left the church that day still protesting her treatment, still insisting that everyone else was being unreasonable. In the months following Dad's death, Sofia made increasingly desperate attempts to re-establish family connections, particularly with Mom, who she seemed to believe might be more sympathetic without Dad's influence. She sent flowers on Mom's birthday with cards expressing love and regret.
She showed up at the house unannounced, claiming she needed to collect personal items that Dad had wanted her to have. She even contacted Mom's doctor, falsely claiming to be an involved daughter who needed updates on her mother's health following the stress of Dad's death. Each attempt was met with firm but polite refusal. Mom had found strength in Dad's example and Elena's support, developing the confidence to maintain boundaries even when doing so felt emotionally difficult. She began to understand that protecting herself from Sofia's manipulation wasn't cruel or unforgiving but necessary for her own well-being and healing. The widow's grief support group that Elena had helped her find reinforced these insights, as other group members shared their own experiences with family members who complicated the grieving process through selfish behavior. My work with the Red Cross had become more than just volunteer service. It had become a way to transform my painful experience with Sofia's betrayal into something meaningful and helpful for other families. I specialized in working with families who had been separated during disasters, helping to verify information, coordinate reunification efforts, and provide support for people dealing with conflicting reports about their loved ones' safety. My personal experience with false reporting made me particularly effective at recognizing when information didn't align with reality. During a training session for new volunteers, Lisa asked me to share my story as an example of how family dynamics could complicate disaster response efforts. Standing in front of 20 potential volunteers, I found myself telling the story of Hurricane Isabella and Sofia's betrayal in clinical professional terms. I explained how false reporting affected resource allocation, how family conflicts could endanger vulnerable populations, and how emergency responders needed to be aware of the possibility that not all family members could be trusted to provide accurate information. The questions that followed my presentation revealed how shocking my experience was to people who hadn't lived through similar betrayals. One volunteer asked whether family members who provided false information during disasters could face legal consequences. Another wondered how emergency responders could verify family reports when time was critical and communication systems were compromised. A third asked whether there were warning signs that might indicate when family reports were unreliable. These questions helped me understand that Sofia's behavior during Hurricane Isabella wasn't just personally devastating, but represented a broader problem that affected emergency response systems. Family members who prioritized their own comfort over accurate reporting created risks not just for their immediate family, but for the entire community's disaster response efforts. Resources directed toward non-existent problems meant fewer resources available for actual emergencies. False reports of safe evacuations meant that truly vulnerable families might not receive priority assistance. This perspective transformed my anger about Sofia's betrayal into something more productive and forward-looking. Instead of remaining focused on the personal hurt she had caused, I began channeling my energy into preventing similar situations from affecting other families. I developed training materials that helped emergency responders recognize potential red flags in family reports. I created protocols for verifying evacuation information through multiple sources. I even worked with legal experts to understand when false disaster reporting constituted criminal behavior. The one-year anniversary of Hurricane Isabella brought an unexpected development that tested everything I had learned about forgiveness, boundaries, and moving forward from betrayal. Sofia appeared at my apartment on a Saturday morning in late September, looking haggard and desperate in a way I had never seen before. Her usual polished appearance was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks and had been crying for hours. "Maya, please, I need to talk to you," she said through my security door, her voice breaking with emotion. "I know you don't want to see me, I know you have every right to hate me, but please give me 5 minutes to say what I came here to say." Against my better judgment, curiosity about what could have reduced my formerly confident sister to this state made me open the door. Sofia's appearance was shocking. She had lost significant weight, her clothes hung loosely on her frame, and her hair looked like it hadn't been professionally styled in months. But more disturbing than her physical appearance was the genuine desperation in her eyes, a quality I had never seen before during her previous attempts to re-establish family contact. Something had happened that had fundamentally altered her usual self-assured demeanor. "Maya, David left me," she said as soon as I let her inside my apartment. 3 weeks ago, he moved out and filed for divorce. He said he couldn't live with someone who could abandon family during a life-threatening emergency, someone who could lie to emergency services to cover up her selfishness. He said that learning what I did during the hurricane made him question everything he thought he knew about my character. The irony of this revelation was overwhelming. David, the husband whose work emergency Sofia had used to justify her abandonment of our family, had ultimately been disgusted by her behavior during Hurricane Isabella. The comfortable suburban lifestyle she had prioritized over family loyalty had been destroyed by the very choices she had made to protect it. The marriage she had valued more than her relationships with parents and sister had ended because her husband couldn't respect someone capable of such calculated betrayal. Sofia collapsed onto my couch, sobbing with the kind of raw emotion that suggested genuine anguish rather than her usual performative displays of distress. He said he couldn't trust me to be there for him if he ever needed me, couldn't trust me to tell the truth when it mattered, couldn't trust me to put anyone's needs ahead of my own convenience. He said that if I could abandon my dying father during a hurricane, I would abandon anyone when it suited my purposes. As Sofia continued talking through her tears, the full scope of how Hurricane Isabella had ultimately destroyed everything she had tried to protect became clear. David's colleagues had learned about her false reporting to the Red Cross, damaging her reputation in their social circles. Her clients at the marketing firm had lost confidence in her reliability and honesty, leading to lost accounts and professional setbacks. Friends who had initially supported her during the family conflict had gradually distanced themselves as more details about her behavior became known. "I lost everything I thought mattered," Sofia said, looking at me with desperate eyes. "My marriage, my career momentum, my social standing, my financial security. And the worst part is that I lost it all because I was trying to protect those exact things instead of doing what was right for our family. I sacrificed everything that actually mattered to protect things that weren't worth protecting." For the first time since Hurricane Isabella, Sofia seemed to understand the full scope of what she had done and why it was wrong. She wasn't making excuses or minimizing her behavior but accepting responsibility for choices that had destroyed multiple relationships and compromised her entire life structure. The consequences she had avoided for so long had finally caught up with her, and she was experiencing the full weight of accountability she had spent months trying to escape. "David made me go to therapy," she continued, "individual counseling to figure out why I made such terrible choices. The therapist helped me understand that I've been selfish my entire life, that I've been taking advantage of family members who covered for my failures and made excuses for my behavior. She said I never learned to consider other people's needs, because there were always people willing to compensate for my selfishness." This admission represented a level of self-awareness that Sofia had never demonstrated before. She was acknowledging patterns of behavior that had existed long before Hurricane Isabella, recognizing that her betrayal during the storm wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of decades of self-centered choices. The therapy had apparently forced her to confront truths about herself that she had previously been able to avoid through charm, excuses, and other people's willingness to enable her behavior. "Maya, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I can't undo the pain I caused Dad during his final months, or the burden I placed on you during the worst crisis our family ever faced. I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't fix the damage I did or restore the trust I destroyed. But I needed you to know that I finally understand what I did and why it was so wrong." The conversation that followed was unlike any Sofia and I had ever had. She asked detailed questions about Dad's final months, wanting to understand how her absence had affected his emotional state and physical condition. She expressed genuine remorse for the additional stress she had placed on Mom during an already devastating time. She acknowledged the years of extra responsibility I had carried to compensate for her unreliability and the unfairness of expectations that had fallen disproportionately on me. Most significantly, Sofia didn't ask for anything. She didn't request forgiveness, didn't seek reinstatement in family relationships, didn't suggest that her newfound self-awareness should lead to restored family status. She simply wanted me to know that she finally understood the magnitude of her failures and the pain they had caused people she claimed to love. The absence of demands or expectations made her apology feel more genuine than any of her previous attempts at reconciliation. "What are you going to do now?" I asked her as our conversation drew to a close. Sofia's entire life structure had collapsed, and she was facing the challenge of rebuilding from scratch with a more accurate understanding of her own character and limitations. "I'm moving back to San Antonio to be near some extended family members who might give me a chance to prove I've changed," she said. "I'm starting over completely. New job, new living situation, new approach to relationships. My therapist says that real change requires putting myself in situations where I have to practice being the kind of person I want to become, rather than the person I've always been." As Sofia prepared to leave my apartment that day, I found myself in the unexpected position of feeling genuine sympathy for her despite everything she had done. She had finally experienced the consequences of her selfish choices, had lost everything she had tried to protect through her betrayal, and was facing the difficult work of rebuilding her life with greater self-awareness and accountability. The punishment she was experiencing wasn't something imposed by our family, but the natural result of choices that had ultimately been unsustainable. "Sophia," I said as she reached my door, "I appreciate you coming here and being honest about what you've learned. I can see that you're genuinely trying to understand and change. But you need to know that understanding doesn't automatically restore relationships. Trust has to be rebuilt through consistent behavior over time, not through apologies or insight." She nodded, tears still flowing down her cheeks. "I know I'm not asking for anything from you or Mom. I just wanted you to know that Dad was right about my character, that your disappointment in me was justified, and that I'm finally trying to become someone worthy of the family love I took for granted and abused." After Sophia left, I sat in my apartment processing the strange mixture of emotions her visit had created. There was satisfaction in knowing that she had finally faced consequences for her behavior and developed genuine understanding of how her choices had hurt our family. There was sadness for the relationships that had been irreparably damaged, and the time that had been lost to her selfishness, and our family's enabling of that selfishness. But there was also a sense of closure that came from knowing the truth had ultimately prevailed, and justice had been served. Over the following months, I occasionally received updates about Sophia's life in San Antonio through mutual family connections. She was working at a nonprofit organization focused on disaster relief, apparently channeling her experience with Hurricane Isabella into service for others affected by similar emergencies. She was living modestly, attending therapy regularly, and making slow progress toward rebuilding relationships with extended family members who were willing to give her supervised chances to demonstrate change. These reports suggested that Sophia's transformation might be genuine rather than another performance designed to manipulate her way back into family good standing. The fact that she was working in disaster relief, facing daily reminders of how her behavior during Hurricane Isabella had violated the trust and vulnerability of families in crisis, seemed particularly appropriate. If she was truly committed to change, this work would provide constant opportunities to practice the selflessness and reliability she had never developed before. Mom and I never discussed whether Sophia's apparent transformation should affect our boundaries with her. The damage she had caused during Dad's final months couldn't be undone through personal growth or professional service. The trust she had destroyed through her calculated deception couldn't be restored through therapy or career changes. Our family had healed and found peace without her involvement, and there was no compelling reason to risk that peace by giving her access to hurt us again. The second anniversary of Hurricane Isabella passed quietly, marked by my volunteer work with Red Cross disaster preparedness rather than by dwelling on painful memories. I had become a regional coordinator for family reunification efforts, helping to develop systems that could prevent the kinds of false reporting that had affected our family's experience. My work had expanded beyond disaster response to include training for social workers, law enforcement officers, and medical personnel who might encounter family situations where conflicting information suggested deception or manipulation. Alina had become Mom's primary support system and closest friend, filling some of the emotional space that Sophia's involvement had occupied before her betrayal. Their relationship was based on mutual care, shared interests, and genuine affection rather than obligation or biological connection. Alina's presence in our family proved that relationships based on choice and demonstrated commitment could be stronger and more sustaining than relationships based purely on blood ties. Mom had found her own path toward healing and purpose in the years following Dad's death. She became involved with a support group for families affected by terminal illness, helping other wives and mothers navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of caring for dying loved ones. Her experience with Sophia's abandonment during Dad's illness gave her unique insights into how family conflicts could complicate end-of-life care, and the importance of establishing boundaries with family members who created additional stress during medical crises. I used to think that family loyalty meant accepting any behavior from family members, no matter how harmful or selfish, Mom told me during one of our regular coffee dates. I thought that unconditional love meant having no conditions, even when people repeatedly hurt you or failed to meet basic obligations. But watching your father's strength in setting boundaries with Sophia taught me that real love sometimes requires protecting yourself and other family members from destructive behavior. This insight had transformed Mom's approach to all her relationships, not just her interactions with Sofia. She had learned to recognize when people were taking advantage of her generosity, to establish limits on what she would tolerate from others, and to prioritize her own well-being, instead of constantly accommodating people who didn't reciprocate her care and consideration. The woman who had spent decades making excuses for Sofia's selfishness had become someone capable of maintaining healthy boundaries, even when doing so was emotionally difficult. As I reflected on the 3 years that had passed since Hurricane Isabella, I could see how the crisis had ultimately strengthened the relationships that survived it while eliminating relationships that had been based on false foundations. Mom Elena and I had developed deeper connections based on shared values, mutual support, and genuine understanding of each other's character. The family gatherings that had once been tense negotiations around Sofia's availability and reactions had become peaceful celebrations of people who actually wanted to be together. My professional work with disaster response had given me purpose and meaning that extended far beyond my personal experience with family betrayal. Every family I helped reunite during emergencies, every false report I identified before it could misdirect resources, every training session I conducted for emergency responders, represented a small victory against the kind of selfishness and deception that Sofia had demonstrated during our family's crisis. The Red Cross had recognized my expertise in family dynamics during disasters, promoting me to a leadership position that allowed me to influence policy development and training protocols across the region. My experience with Sofia's false reporting had led to new verification procedures that could prevent similar situations from affecting other families. The pain of our personal betrayal had been transformed into systemic improvements that protected vulnerable families during their darkest moments. Standing in my office at the Red Cross Regional Headquarters, looking out at the Houston skyline where Sofia had once worked, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected gifts that had emerged from our family's trauma. Hurricane Isabella had revealed painful truths about Sofia's character, but it had also revealed the strength and resilience of the family members, who had faced that crisis with integrity and mutual support. Dad's decision to hold Sofia accountable for her betrayal had been vindicated by time and results. Our family's peace and healing in the years following his death proved that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal comes at significant emotional cost. The boundaries he had established hadn't been cruel or unforgiving, but necessary for protecting the family members who deserved care and consideration. The afternoon sun streaming through my office windows reminded me that Hurricane Isabella had been both an ending and a beginning. It had ended our illusions about Sofia's character and our family's ability to maintain unity, regardless of individual behavior. But it had also begun a new chapter of authentic relationships, meaningful work, and purposeful living that honored the values Dad had tried to instill in both his daughters. Some families are bound together by blood and sustained by love. Others are bound together by blood, but sustained by accommodation and enabling that ultimately serves no one's best interests. Hurricane Isabella had taught us the difference between these two kinds of family relationships and given us the courage to choose authenticity over comfortable illusions. The sister I thought I had never existed, but the family I actually needed, had emerged from the storm stronger and more genuine than before. In losing Sofia, we had found ourselves. In facing the truth about her character, we had discovered our own strength. In refusing to enable her destructive behavior, we had learned what family loyalty actually meant. The hurricane had passed, but the lessons it taught us continued to guide our choices and strengthen our relationships. Every day I worked to help other families navigate their own storms with the wisdom that our suffering had provided. Every day I celebrated the authentic connections that had survived our crisis and grown deeper through shared adversity. Hurricane Isabella had taken much from us, but it had also given us something invaluable. The knowledge that real family isn't defined by biology, but by character, commitment, and the willingness to put love into action when it matters most. 5 years after Hurricane Isabella forever altered the landscape of our family, I found myself standing on the rebuilt Galveston seawall, watching the same Gulf waters that had once brought such devastation to our lives. The physical scars of the hurricane had long since healed, with new construction replacing damaged buildings and updated infrastructure designed to better withstand future storms. But the emotional transformation that began during those dark September days continued to shape every aspect of my life in ways I could never have imagined. The morning breeze carried the salt scent that had always defined this coastal community, a reminder that some things remain constant even as everything else changes around them. I was here for the dedication of a new emergency shelter facility, one that incorporated lessons learned from Hurricane Isabella and dozens of other disasters that had affected Gulf Coast communities over the past decade. As the lead consultant on family reunification protocols, I had helped design systems that would prevent the kind of false reporting and resource misdirection that had complicated our family's experience during the storm. The shelter bore Dad's name, the Miguel Rodriguez Emergency Family Center, a tribute that Mom and I had arranged through a combination of Red Cross recommendations and community fundraising efforts. Dad would have been proud to know that his experience as a vulnerable person during a disaster had contributed to creating better support systems for future families facing similar crises. The dedication plaque included his favorite saying about family loyalty, words that had guided his decision to hold Sofia accountable and had shaped our family's healing journey ever since. Dr. Sandra Mitchell, the hospital social worker, who had become a close friend during Dad's final months, approached me as I stood looking out at the water. She had been instrumental in developing the medical support protocols for the new shelter, ensuring that families with vulnerable members would have access to appropriate care during emergencies. Her work had been partially inspired by
witnessing how Dad's condition had deteriorated in the inadequate environment of the original emergency shelter during Hurricane Isabella. "Maya, your father would be so proud of what this facility represents," she said, standing beside me as we watched volunteers conducting training exercises in the parking lot below. "The medical bay we designed specifically addresses the kinds of challenges your family faced during the hurricane. No terminal cancer patient will ever again have to spend a hurricane on a gymnasium floor because that's the only shelter available." The medical bay was indeed impressive, featuring private rooms for families with serious health conditions, specialized equipment for various medical needs, and trained nursing staff available around the clock during shelter operations. But more importantly, the facility incorporated comprehensive verification systems for family reporting, ensuring that accurate information would guide resource allocation and emergency response efforts. The kind of false reporting that Sofia had used to cover her abandonment would be immediately detected and corrected in this new system. Elena arrived shortly before the dedication ceremony was scheduled to begin, accompanied by Mom, who had become increasingly involved in disaster preparedness advocacy as a way of honoring Dad's memory and processing her own trauma from Hurricane Isabella. At 73, Mom possessed an energy and purpose that she had never displayed during the years when she was constantly managing Sofia's drama and accommodating her selfishness. Freedom from that emotional burden had allowed her to discover passions and capabilities that had been suppressed by decades of family crisis management. Miguel would have loved seeing all these families learning how to prepare for disasters together, Mom said as we watched parents and children participating in evacuation drills and emergency communication exercises. He always believed that communities became stronger when people took care of each other during difficult times. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on any of us, given that our own family had been fractured by one member's refusal to embrace that philosophy during our greatest time of need. The dedication ceremony brought together emergency responders, community leaders, and families who had been affected by various disasters over the years. Many of the speakers referenced Hurricane Isabella as a turning point in how the region approached family support during emergencies, though few knew the personal story behind the improved protocols and verification systems that were now standard practice throughout the Gulf Coast Emergency Response Network. Governor Sarah Martinez, who had served as Harris County Emergency Coordinator during Hurricane Isabella, spoke about the importance of accurate information during disaster response and the devastating consequences that could result from false reporting. She referenced several cases where families had been endangered by incorrect information about their safety status, though she didn't specifically mention our situation out of respect for our privacy. Her speech emphasized how community resilience depended on individual honesty and family members supporting each other rather than pursuing personal interests during crises. As the ceremony continued, I noticed a familiar figure standing at the back of the crowd, someone I hadn't seen in over 2 years but recognized immediately despite the changes that time and circumstances had brought. Sofia stood quietly behind a group of other attendees, her appearance dramatically different from the polished professional I remembered from before Hurricane Isabella. She looked older, more weathered, with the kind of subdued demeanor that suggested someone who had learned difficult lessons about life and responsibility. My first instinct was to alert security or ask Elena to help escort Sofia away from the event, but something about her presence seemed different from her previous attempts to insert herself into family occasions.
She wasn't trying to approach Mom or me, wasn't making any effort to draw attention to herself, and seemed genuinely focused on the ceremony rather than on creating drama or seeking reconciliation. For the first time since Hurricane Isabella, Sofia appeared to be respecting boundaries rather than testing them. After the ceremony concluded and most attendees had dispersed, Sofia approached me hesitantly, maintaining a respectful distance that acknowledged the boundaries our family had established. She looked nervous and uncertain, far removed from the confident manipulator who had once convinced emergency officials that our family was safely evacuated while knowing we were actually facing a hurricane alone. "Maya, I hope it's okay that I came today. I saw the announcement about the dedication in the San Antonio newspaper and wanted to pay my respects to Dad's memory. I didn't come to cause problems or try to reconcile with family. I just thought it was important to honor what his experience contributed to helping other families." Her voice carried a sincerity that I had never heard before, suggesting that the personal transformation she had begun years earlier might have developed into something genuine and lasting. I studied Sofia's face, looking for signs of the manipulation and self-serving behavior that had characterized all our previous interactions since Hurricane Isabella. But what I saw instead was someone who appeared genuinely humbled by experience, marked by consequences, and committed to respecting boundaries even when doing so was personally painful. The sister who had once demanded attention and accommodation had been replaced by someone who understood that respect had to be earned through consistent behavior rather than claimed through biological relationship. "How did you know about the dedication?" I asked, curious about how information had reached her despite our family's careful efforts to maintain separation from her life and activities. "I've been following the Red Cross family reunification work online," Sofia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not to intrude or gather information about you and Mom, but because my work in San Antonio disaster relief connects to some of the same protocols you've been developing. I've learned a lot from the training materials you've created, though I've never identified myself or tried to make contact through professional channels." This revelation surprised me, suggesting that Sofia had been aware of my career development and professional contributions without attempting to use that knowledge to re-establish personal contact. It indicated a level of restraint and boundary respect that the old Sofia had never demonstrated, someone who could acknowledge family members' achievements without trying to claim credit or demand recognition for her own supposed growth and change. "The work you're doing is important," Sofia continued, "and I wanted you to know that even though I can't be part of your life anymore, I'm proud of how you've transformed our family's trauma into something that helps other families avoid similar pain. Dad would be proud too, and I needed to say that even if this is the only opportunity I ever have to express it." Elena had noticed our conversation and positioned herself nearby, ready to intervene if Sofia's presence became disruptive or inappropriate. But she seemed to recognize, as I did, that something fundamental had changed in Sofia's approach to family interaction. This wasn't the demanding, manipulative person who had spent years expecting accommodation and forgiveness regardless of her behavior. This was someone who had learned to offer respect without expecting anything in return. "Sofia, I appreciate you coming to honor Dad's memory," I said carefully, "but you should know that your presence here doesn't change anything about our family boundaries. Mom and I have built good lives without the stress and uncertainty that characterized our relationship with you for so many years. We're not interested in revisiting those dynamics, even if you've made personal changes." Sofia nodded immediately, her response suggesting that she had expected exactly this reaction and was prepared to accept it without argument or protest. "I understand completely, and I'm not asking for anything. I know that trust can't be rebuilt through apologies or good intentions. I know that the damage I caused during Dad's illness can't be repaired through personal growth or professional service. I just wanted to pay my respects and acknowledge the good work you're doing." The conversation that followed was brief but revealing. Sofia explained that she had spent the past 5 years rebuilding her life from the ground up, starting with extensive therapy to understand the character flaws that had led to her betrayal during Hurricane Isabella. She had lost everything she had tried to protect through her selfishness, including her marriage, her professional reputation, and most of her financial security. But those losses had forced her to confront truths about herself that she had avoided for decades. Her work in San Antonio disaster relief had been deliberately chosen as a form of ongoing accountability, forcing her to face daily reminders of how her behavior during Hurricane Isabella had violated the trust and vulnerability of families in crisis. Every family she helped reunite during emergencies, every false report she identified and corrected, every training session she conducted for emergency responders represented a small attempt to atone for the harm she had caused our family during our darkest hour. "I'll never forgive myself for what I did to Dad during his final months," Sofia said, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I'll never stop regretting that I chose my own comfort over his safety and dignity during a life-threatening emergency. But I've tried to channel that regret into service for other families, hoping that maybe I can prevent other people from experiencing the kind of abandonment and betrayal that I inflicted on our family." There was something undeniably authentic about Sofia's remorse and her commitment to making amends through service rather than through attempts to restore family relationships. She seemed to understand that some damage couldn't be repaired, that some trust couldn't be rebuilt, and that genuine accountability meant accepting permanent consequences rather than expecting eventual forgiveness and reconciliation. As Sofia prepared to leave, she turned back to me one final time with a request that surprised me with its thoughtfulness and restraint. "Maya, if it's not too much to ask, could you tell Mom that I was here today? Not because I expect anything from her, but because I want her to know that I remember Dad with love and respect, even though I failed him so completely when he needed me most." I found myself nodding, recognizing that this simple request represented exactly the kind of boundary-respecting behavior that the old Sofia had never demonstrated. She was asking for a message to be conveyed rather than demanding direct access. She was expressing love and respect without expecting those feelings to be reciprocated. She was acknowledging her failures without minimizing them or seeking absolution. After Sofia disappeared into the crowd of departing ceremony attendees, Elena approached me with a thoughtful expression that suggested she had been observing our interaction carefully. As someone who had witnessed Sofia's previous manipulative behavior and had helped our family maintain boundaries during her attempts at reconciliation, Elena was uniquely qualified to assess whether Sofia's apparent transformation represented genuine change or simply more sophisticated manipulation. "That was different," Elena said quietly. "She didn't ask for anything, didn't try to minimize what she did, didn't suggest that time should heal wounds or that family relationships should supersede accountability. She actually seemed to understand that some consequences are permanent and that respect means accepting those consequences rather than fighting them." Elena's assessment aligned with my own observations about Sofia's changed demeanor and approach. The person who had visited the dedication ceremony bore little resemblance to the entitled manipulator who had abandoned our family during Hurricane Isabella, and then spent months trying to avoid accountability for her actions. This Sofia seemed genuinely humbled by experience, marked by consequences, and committed to service rather than self-interest. That evening, as Mom and I shared dinner at her favorite restaurant overlooking Galveston Bay, I told her about Sofia's presence at the dedication ceremony and her request that I convey her love and respect for Dad's memory. Mom listened thoughtfully, showing neither anger nor excitement about this unexpected contact from her estranged elder daughter. "I'm glad she came to honor your father," Mom said finally. "Miguel deserved to have both his daughters acknowledge the good work that came from his suffering during Hurricane Isabella. But I hope she understands that honoring his memory doesn't restore her place in our family. Some bridges can't be rebuilt, even when people change." Mom's response reflected the wisdom she had gained through years of processing Sofia's betrayal and building a life free from the stress and manipulation that had characterized their previous relationship. She had learned to appreciate genuine expressions of respect without interpreting them as invitations to resume damaged relationships. She could acknowledge Sofia's apparent growth without feeling obligated to test that growth by allowing renewed access to hurt the family again. The months that followed brought occasional indirect updates about Sofia's life and work in San Antonio. Through mutual connections in the disaster relief community, I learned that she had become a respected trainer in family reunification protocols, that her programs had helped improve emergency response procedures throughout South Texas, and that she had maintained her commitment to therapy and personal growth. But these updates came without any attempts at direct contact or suggestions that her professional success should influence our family's boundaries. One particularly meaningful update came from Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the hospital social worker who had helped our family navigate Dad's final illness. She had attended a conference where Sofia presented training materials on preventing false reporting during disaster response, materials that referenced Hurricane Isabella as a case study without identifying our family specifically. According to Dr. Martinez, Sofia's presentation was powerful and effective, demonstrating deep understanding of how family conflicts could endanger vulnerable populations during emergencies. She talked about Hurricane Isabella, with the kind of expertise that comes from having lived through the consequences of false reporting. Dr. Martinez told me during one of our regular coffee meetings. But she also talked about it with obvious regret and remorse, like someone who understood exactly how destructive that behavior could be for families and emergency responders. It was clear that she wasn't just teaching abstract concepts but sharing lessons learned through personal failure. This information reinforced my growing sense that Sofia's transformation might be genuine rather than performative. The fact that she was using Hurricane Isabella as a teaching tool, acknowledging its impact without identifying our family or seeking sympathy, suggested someone who had learned to take responsibility for her actions while channeling that accountability into meaningful service for others. As the 5-year anniversary of Hurricane Isabella approached, I found myself reflecting on how completely that crisis had transformed every aspect of our family relationships and individual life paths. The storm had revealed fundamental truths about character, loyalty, and the difference between enabling and loving that had reshaped our understanding of what family relationships should look like. Mom had evolved from someone who constantly accommodated destructive behavior to someone who maintained healthy boundaries and prioritized her own well-being. Elena had become the reliable family member we had always hoped Sofia could be, offering support and companionship based on genuine care rather than obligation. I had transformed my painful experience with family betrayal into professional expertise that helped other families navigate similar challenges. Most significantly, we had all learned that authentic relationships required mutual respect, shared values, and demonstrated commitment rather than biological connection alone. The family we had built in the aftermath of Sofia's betrayal was smaller but stronger, based on choice rather than obligation, sustained by trust rather than hope for eventual change. The anniversary also brought a letter from Sofia, the first direct communication she had attempted in over 2 years. The letter was brief and respectful, acknowledging the anniversary of Hurricane Isabella and expressing continued remorse for her role in worsening our family's crisis during that time. She didn't ask for forgiveness or suggest meeting, but simply wanted us to know that she thought about Dad's suffering every September and had dedicated her professional work to preventing other families from experiencing similar abandonment during disasters. Mom and I read the letter together, both of us noting how different its tone was from Sofia's previous attempts at communication. There were no excuses, no minimization of her behavior, no suggestions that time should heal wounds, or that family relationships should supersede accountability. It was simply an acknowledgement of harm caused, responsibility accepted, and ongoing commitment to making amends through service rather than through restored relationships. She finally sounds like someone who understands what she did and why it was unforgivable, Mom said after we finished reading. I'm glad she's found a way to transform her failures into something helpful for other families. But understanding doesn't erase the past, and service doesn't restore trust. Some consequences last forever, even when people change. Mom's assessment captured perfectly the complex emotions that Sofia's apparent transformation had created for our family. We could acknowledge her growth without feeling obligated to test it. We could appreciate her service without allowing her renewed access to hurt us. We could recognize her remorse without expecting it to restore relationships that had been irreparably damaged by her choices during our greatest crisis. Standing once again on the Galveston seawall as the sun set over the Gulf waters, I thought about the unexpected gifts that had emerged from Hurricane Isabella's devastation. The storm had destroyed our illusions about Sofia's character, but it had also revealed the strength and resilience of family members, who faced crisis with integrity and mutual support. It had ended comfortable fictions about unconditional family loyalty, but it had begun authentic relationships based on demonstrated character and shared values. The hurricane had taught us that real family isn't defined by biology, but by reliability during crisis, honesty during conflict, and willingness to put love into action when it matters most. Some people rise to meet those standards when tested, while others reveal that they never possessed the character necessary for genuine family membership. Hurricane Isabella had sorted our family into these categories with brutal clarity, but the sorting had ultimately made us stronger. Dad's legacy lived on not just in the emergency shelter that bore his name, but in the principles he had demonstrated during his final months, that accountability was an expression of love, that boundaries protected rather than excluded, and that authentic relationships required courage to face difficult truths. His decision to hold Sofia responsible for her betrayal had been vindicated by 5 years of peace and healing for the family members who had proven their worth through their actions during crisis. The sister I thought I had never existed, but the family I actually needed had emerged from the storm stronger, more genuine, and more deeply connected than ever before. In losing Sofia, we had found ourselves. In facing the truth about her character, we had discovered our own strength. In refusing to enable her destructive behavior, we had learned what family loyalty actually meant. Hurricane Isabella had passed, but the lessons it taught continued to guide our choices and strengthen our relationships. Every day brought new opportunities to help other families navigate their own storms with the wisdom that our suffering had provided. Every sunset over the Gulf waters reminded us that some endings create space for better beginnings, and that authentic love sometimes requires the courage to let go of relationships that cause more harm than healing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.